Could the seed oils be the primary cause of the diseases of civilization?
This video is going to show you why you need to be adding sesame oil to your diet, why you should be cooking with sesame oil.
Those two components of your vegetable seed oils are actually very pro-inflammatory.
Is the vegan oil-free diet beneficial for health or just another form of extreme restrictive eating?
Maybe even toxic. Vegetable oil.
Remember, oils are rancid products. They oxidize really easily. They go rancid and bad.
But wait, I thought carbs made us fat. No, this is what I'm saying. Carbohydrates don't make you fat, you guys. Linoleic acid makes you fat.
So in summary, black seed pretty much handles about every single problem that you may experience.
What have your comments gotten me into? Hey, Chris, they said, can you clarify the confusion around seed oils? It will be fun, they said. I don't even have a horse in this race because whatever the answer, I'm fine with it. Although hummus is a little more tasty with some olive oil in it, am I right? And so are these delicious tamales that I get from the farmer's market that my dog wants. But I can deal if there's something to the current panic over seed oils because we have plenty of delicious oil-free recipes. So here's the lay of the land. On the scale of plant-free to animal-free, both camps found something to agree on. No processed foods. Most of the leading lights in both camps consider oils to be processed and bad for health. But both diets have close cousins that don't agree. The traditional Mediterranean diet, the way it was 50 years ago before so much processed food and meat entered the picture, leans heavily into plants, and they have always believed olive oil is healthy. The ancestral diets lean into meat, and they usually believe coconut, olive, and sesame seed oils are healthy. I don't know how our hunter-gatherer ancestors imported coconut oil, but whatever. Vegans and carnivores have other cousins too, and those cousins seem to stick together in their beliefs. Another fascinating view of the landscape is who is getting views on social media versus how much science they do. The influencers without scientific backgrounds like YouTubers Joe Rogan and What I've Learned are super popular. A few journalists are not far behind, and so are some doctors who devote a lot of time to social media influencing. Way, way, way down the popularity curve are nutrition scientists who spend their days actually doing science. The occasional exception is one who makes it big on the TED stage, but that's usually a one-speech affair. So what if we try to cut through the fog by taking the road less traveled and hear from scientists way down at the bottom of the popularity curve and see if that makes all the difference? In this episode, we'll consider the high meat eaters' beliefs first, then the keto community, then Mediterranean, and finally the vegans. We'll see if scientists can be the candle in the dark that Carl Sagan admired, so we can end with a simple, compelling conclusion. Let's start with a journalist and a social media doctor up the popularity curve who are known for promoting animal foods.
Vegetable oils, oils of any kind, were really not used for human consumption. They were used for industrial machinery as lubricants. I mean, first it was really whale oil from the 1820s to the 1860s. And then when we killed all the whales, we moved over to cottonseed oil.
There was no such thing as a seed oil before 1870.
And here's a scientist from the bottom of the popularity curve, Dorothea Betagian. She points out sesame oil goes back millennia and was prominent in diets well before the birth of Christ. Here's just one passage from the paper. Medieval Arabian culinary use. Sesame oil was such a prominent ingredient that it had its own name, shiraj. I probably butchered that pronunciation. It was the preferred cooking fat for chicken and the usual fat in making pastries and sweetmeats. It was also a flavoring stirred into pudding. 3 archaeologists wrote this beautiful book on olive oil in the Holy Land. It was one of the earliest and biggest industries in Israel with presses all over the country. Did you know they found casks of olive oil in Israel that are 8,000 years old?
They're not natural. These are the natural fats that humans ate for millennia.
One factor in the use of plant oils has been the dietary tradition of Jews, Hindus, and Muslims who have traditionally frowned on the use of animal fats. Oreo famously spent millions of dollars kosherizing Oreos in the mid-1990s, and that meant getting the lard out. As you can see, I have an unnatural interest in food history.
Honey, how many books on food history does one man need? And half of yours are on Kindle. Do you have a book problem?
Yes, I do. Speaking of my Kindle, I have cookbooks from colonial and Civil War era America, and here's a cookbook from the time of Julian of Norwich in the late 1300s. Here's an American recipe for French slaw in 1850. To 1 pint of the cut cabbage, have 3 eggs boiled hard, mash the yolks with a spoon, and add gradually 1 wine glassful of oil. Then pour in 1 wine glass of vinegar, 1 teaspoonful of common mustard, or a dessert spoonful of French mustard, salt, and cayenne pepper to taste. They typically used peanut, sunflower, or olive oil. Their mayonnaise recipes were full of it. This thick book by 3 food history professors points out that the staples of the Greeks and Romans were bread, wine, and oil. By the way, there's a perception that we in the 2000s are more obsessed and confused by diet than our ancestors were. But when you read these books, you find out that people were always that way. For example, here's a Carnivore book from 1907, during a period when that diet rose to popularity, fueled in part by Teddy Roosevelt. I got a really big kick out of reading the preface. This subject was never so widely studied, and apparently never were there so many peculiar and clashing foodal ideas as now. One belief from previous centuries we can learn from is they thought variety was the key to health. Here's a recipe for salad from the 1300s. Parsley, sage, green beans, scallions, lettuce, leeks, spinach, mint, green onions, fennel, rosemary, purslane, watercress, primrose, and violets. You may not be able to find all these ingredients, but do what you can. Mix them well with oil, vinegar, and salt. Let's try another point.
Because heart disease really only was rare until the late 1920s.
Here's what the scientists say. They performed CT scans on 137 mummies from across 4 continents and found artery plaque in every single population studied, from pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers in the Aleutian Islands to the ancient Puebloans of the southwestern United States. But Chris, you say, what about when social media influencers do reference scientific studies?
Back in the 1960s, Ivan France conducted a meticulously controlled study that would shed light on what actually happens when people cut out saturated fats and eat polyunsaturated vegetable fats instead. The study, which would be called the Minnesota Coronary Survey, took years to set up and had more than 9,000 research subjects. Since people were living in institutions, they could control exactly what the people ate.
To this day, it stands as one of the most rigorous diet trials ever conducted. So what does the Minnesota study show? The patients on the vegetable oil diet did end up with lower cholesterol than the people who ate food cooked with animal fats. But the vegetable oil people didn't live longer.
That study generated sensational headlines. The data for it was never published, and it was found in a basement 5 decades later, and it seemed to overturn the prevailing theory about fats. The lead scientist for that study worked at the University of Minnesota with one of the most famous nutrition scientists ever, Ancel Keys, the man credited with popularizing the Mediterranean diet and associating saturated fat with heart disease. And yet this study was suppressed, so the story goes, because it didn't support the hypothesis of Ancel Keys. And the study was a blinded, randomized control trial considered the gold standard of evidence, conducted at a unique point in history when you could pull off a trial like that on humans in the 60s. I was hoping I would never have to discuss this trial because it takes me to a very dark place. It was conducted in 6 mental institutions and a nursing home. It turns out my beautiful mom, whom I adored, was struck with schizophrenia at 35 and confined to a mental hospital over and over. My mom and I lived for years on the streets of Oakland when I should have been going to elementary school. You wouldn't think it could happen to a child or to a woman who got a master's degree in organic chemistry from Cornell, but it happened to us. I gave a TEDx talk about it that wrecked me for a while, and if you'd like to know more, I'll link it in the description. I will never get over the tragedy that befell my mom, but I mention it because I think it gives me unique perspective on this study. But let's cheer up and see a couple animals. Oh, look, there's a cute little coyote. Well, hello guys. You want to come over and say hi? I bet you boys caused the lady turkeys to swoon. I believe one of the best things we can do to understand nutrition is to understand just a few simple things about how studies are designed. Otherwise, it's like driving through a thick fog. The first thing is that chronic diseases take a long time to develop, 20 years or more. And so studies have to be designed with that in mind. You can smoke for 20 years and look and feel great the whole time. Studies that involve mortality as an endpoint are the hardest because you have to track a large number of people for a very long time and know why they died. That makes randomized control trials the gold standard for short-term studies, almost impossible for long-term studies. You can't find a large group of people who are willing to change their diet and stick to it for the rest of their lives for your 50-year study. You can do that with drugs because people are willing to take a pill for the rest of their lives, like a statin. No one should take that to mean that you can't do great dietary studies on all-cause mortality over the decades, because we have at least a dozen great ones, including the one that helped us unravel the fact that smoking is unhealthy. Some of you are ready to comment that smoking is easier to study than diet is because it's not distributed among all our foods. Fair point. But we have other examples like trans fats where it took long-term studies to unravel the health effects, and we had no long-term randomized control trials to help us with that either. The second thing that helps immensely is when the study cohort, a fancy name for study participants, have several things in common to reduce confusing variables. For example, 2 of Harvard's studies involve nurses, which have similar socioeconomic backgrounds, which is a major determinant of health. That's what makes studies of populations like hunter-gatherers so difficult. It's hard to find enough of them to get good statistics. Their genetics and lifestyles are quite different than ours. Plus, they have a lot of survivorship bias because they were able to survive childbirth and infections and accidents without the medical care that most Western countries have. The Minnesota coronary experiment seemed like a great idea. They had a great team, they had a lot of money, and they put a lot of effort into the experimental design. They fed one set of patients high levels of corn oil by infusing their meat, milk, and cheese with it and removing some of the saturated fat from those foods. They replaced butter in the diet with a special soft margarine, which they probably didn't realize at the time had a form of trans fat, which was pretty damaging. But tragically, this study ran into the problem of cohort selection. They were in and out of the hospital, on and off the program, and struggling with cigarettes and alcohol and depression, which I know all too well about this cohort. I spoke to a great scientist who was very familiar with this study because he was there at the University of Minnesota at that time, also working under Ancel Keys on diet heart studies. It's Henry Blackburn. He's 97 and still publishing and looks great. Here's a photo he sent me last week of him holding his great-grandson. Last fall, we were communicating while he was out on his ski boat. He said factors outside the control of the investigators prevented them from getting meaningful results. He said one of the factors was the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill at that time, a factor which I know all too well because that's how I ended up on the streets with my mom. The lead researcher on this paper gave an interview just before his death, and he said, "I didn't really start to feed the special diets until after the end of that 3-year feasibility study, and that was fatal to the project because during that time, these psychiatric drugs were developed and the patients were getting discharged right and left from these mental hospitals. That prevented me from getting a definitive answer." Dr. France eventually did publish about the study in 1989, and here it is. He said the average length of each hospital stay was 292 days. The average total time in the hospital was 384 days. He also bemoaned the fact that accidents and suicides confounded the data because biopsies didn't always reveal the cause of death. That's something I also know all too well because I lived with the wonderful mentally ill on the streets for so many years, and they suffer more than anyone should have to suffer. Henry is very strict with me about what I can and can't conclude from a study, which is one of the things I love about him. We both admire Dr. France for not trying to torture his data and try to squeeze out uncertain conclusions, but Henry was pretty distraught that this has become the subject of conspiracies 50 years later. There were 2 papers published in the British Medical Journal after recovering some of the raw data Dr. France kept in his basement. One took the point of view it was a good study on the basis that it was a randomized control trial, and because it brought into question the diet-heart hypothesis, since more people died in the corn oil group than on their normal diet. The other paper observed that the data also showed fewer people died who had high blood pressure and who smoked. That paper also observed that only 595 participants were studied for more than a year, and 83% of the control group was lost to follow-up, so we're not actually sure how many of them died. As I listened to people who were so certain this trial was definitive because it contained the words randomized trial, a thought kept coming to my mind. I'll let these 2 weightlifting doctors say it because they seem to be very knowledgeable.
So what I'm getting at is like actual professionals and experts in the field are not arguing about this. It's only like the seed oil conspiracy theorists.
But let's see what the other groups say, because the vegans don't like oils either. Are they conspiracy theorists too? A group of journalists and doctors who are popular on social media and who favor low-carb diets produced the film Fat Fiction and had both things to say.
And the number 1 inflammatory substance in the American diet is sugar. That's it.
They said Ancel Keys, who had enormous influence in nutrition science, showed a stunning chart in 1953.
He specifically looked at 6 countries around the world, and on the x-axis he plotted fat intake and on the y-axis coronary heart disease rates, and he found a straight line relationship.
But he chose 6 countries for that perfect correlation, and at the time there was data available for 22 countries.
And when you put in all of those countries, it just looked like a scatter plot. There was no clear relationship.
No correlation between fat and heart disease.
Bold statement. Another thing that helps immensely in understanding nutrition science is just a little understanding of statistics. Correlation has specific meaning and statisticians put a number on it.
A positive correlation indicates a positive relationship. A positive one would be very strong. This has a correlation of 0.4, which is still fairly positive. A correlation of 0 means there's absolutely no correlation whatsoever. And a negative correlation means there is a correlation, but it is in a negative direction.
So if that chart showed no correlation, it would not go up to the right. It would be flat.
He was criticized at the time by statisticians who said, you're obviously cherry-picking your data.
The two statisticians she was referring to wrote this paper in 1957, and that's where Fat Fiction got the chart. Being good statisticians, they calculated the correlation, and it came out to be 0.39, about the same as the charts we just saw. The paper also noted some countries on their chart, like Sri Lanka, Mexico, and France, had very questionable data. So what was their criticism of Keyes? It was that they also plotted mortality versus animal protein consumption, and the correlation was stronger, 0.465. So maybe it was the protein and not the fat? Wait, what? If the correlation with fat and mortality was like that, and with protein it was steeper, what does that mean? Does that mean consuming more protein and less fat increases mortality? Being good statisticians, they did more correlations, and the answer became clear. When they separated the fat into animal and vegetable, the correlation rose to 0.557 for animal fat, much stronger, and minus 0.509 for vegetable fat, meaning consuming vegetable fat strongly reduced mortality. They also did it for protein, 0.608 for animal protein versus minus 0.483 for vegetable protein. Carbohydrate was also strong, minus 0.386. I assume that was because it was 1957 and the percent of carbs from ultra-processed foods was much lower back then. I read those numbers as meaning seed oils may not be poison because they were a significant portion of the vegetable fats people were consuming. France, for example, has long favored grapeseed oil. This is the paper Fat Fiction based their claims on, so why say there was no correlation between saturated fat and heart disease? And why no mention of the correlation with animal protein or the negative correlation with plant foods? This doesn't feel like conspiracy theory to me, it feels like industry influence. For example, the woman making many of the claims is Nina Teicholz. She runs the Nutrition Coalition, which is funded by a Texas hedge fund billionaire, and it sure looks like it's a front group for the beef industry. Its only activities are lobbying and PR. Nina takes a $144,000 salary according to public disclosures. I have read many books about the beef industry, and their playbook is to hire camera-ready moms like Nina for PR and to dodge questions about the health of red meat by saying, hey, look over there, seed oil. Oh, look over there, sugar. The two statisticians were careful to say the data available to them for the 22 countries was from the United Nations, and it was shaky, and their correlations could neither confirm or rule out the diet heart hypothesis. And that's exactly why Ansel Keys and Henry Blackburn and an international team of scientists set out to collect really good data over the next 50 years.
Keys was determined to prove himself right. He followed up with his famous 7-country study where he traveled to the countries cherry-picked from his graph.
You see what they did there? The 7-country study didn't choose Canada, Australia, England, or Wales. They went to 4 countries not on this chart, including Greece and Yugoslavia, which were not among the 22 countries that had cardiovascular data at the time. They had strong scientific reasons for their selections, which Keys describes in his very thorough book about the 7-country study. They chose Finland because it had the highest heart attack rate in the world, and Japan had the lowest, which provided a 10-fold spread. They chose Greece for its known high-fat consumption from olive oil. They chose the 7 cohorts in Yugoslavia and Greece in part because there was no data about cardiovascular disease rates there, and they didn't want to be accused of cherry-picking. Little did they know that the internet would be invented 35 years later, which would take conspiracies to the next level. When Finland saw the early data, they swung into action by assigning a young scientist to address the problem, and seed oil played a central role. Ansel's early data showed olive oil did not cause heart disease, but animal fats did. In Finland, they couldn't grow olives, but they could grow canola, developed by Canadians. Canola oil means Canada oil, low acid. The Finns were eating thick slices of cheese slathered with butter, so superfit lumberjacks who looked the model of health were dying in their 30s of heart attacks. And over several decades, the Finns reduced their heart attack rates by 80% and increased life expectancy by 20 years. Note this wasn't just an observational study. They chose the North Karelia area as the intervention group and the rest of Finland as the control. When they saw how good the results were, they got all of Finland to consume more canola oil and less animal fat and thoroughly documented it all. So instead of the Minnesota Coronary experiment, which involved a smallish number of people for a short period of time who were not very representative of us, the North Karelia project involved all of Finland for almost 50 years. The young scientist who headed the project is Pekka Puska, who received the World Heart Federation's Lifetime Achievement Award. He's at the bottom of the social media popularity chart too, but fortunately he let me interview him. Some of the commenters on that episode said he's a national hero in Finland, their version of David Attenborough. Pekka said they couldn't adopt a purely Mediterranean diet living in the frozen north as they do, so they came up with their own foods like berries, created their own food pyramid, coordinated with their neighbors, and called it the Nordic diet. And that brings me to the Mediterranean diet, the most studied diet in the world. Walter Willett is a scientist low on the social popularity chart, but he wrote the standard textbook on large population studies. He realized no one had been able to get long-term randomized trials to work on diet.
In theory, you would do large randomized trials. Like you might randomize 20,000 people to either high trans fat or low trans fat diets and follow them for a few decades. Well, the trouble is, that study is going to be very, very hard, probably impossible to do, and now it would be unethical. And the few times that those very sort of super large studies have been tried, they haven't worked very well because people didn't stay on the diet they were assigned to.
So he and his colleagues decided the better design for mortality are called prospective cohorts. Prospective means you follow a population for a very long time.
The study design basically consists of questionnaires that go out every 2 years. They're used to update information about smoking and physical activity, find out who developed heart disease, who developed cancer. And along the way, we've collected toenail clippings that we use for trace element analyses and blood that we use for DNA analysis and biochemical analysis. And we've collected urine. Pretty much everything you could think of asking about, we've asked on these questionnaires. If somebody does report cancer or heart disease, we write to them, get permission to get their medical records. In the case of most cancers, we get permission to get the actual tumor tissue, and now we can do a lot analyzing that. About 90% of the women are still participating after about 40 years in the original Nurses' Health Study. So that's really what has made the study successful.
The reaction on social media to this form of epidemiology from people on social media who have no background in these kind of studies takes me to another dark place. I was an earth scientist for many years involved in water testing, and it was the same movie in that field, but with different actors. Testing would reveal an area where a company was polluting, and we'd see an increased frequency in childhood cancers or heavy metal poisoning. Armed with very sophisticated statistics, hard to say with my face so cold, epidemiologists would do their best to estimate probabilities and project trends. Distraught parents would see that data and become convinced their child's cancer was due to pollution. Company officials would hire the best lawyers money can buy to cast doubt on the scientists. There's a great movie about how this goes down called A Civil Action, starring John Travolta and Robert Duvall. Here's one of the lawyers talking to a company employee who's not sure what to believe.
Al, that water hasn't made anybody sick. Look, if I took 100 pennies, I threw them up in the air, about half of them would land heads and the other half tails, right? Now, if I looked around closely, I'd probably find some heads grouped together in a cluster. What does that mean? Does that mean anything?
Here's another one talking to the parents of victims to create doubt.
Do you have Teflon pans in your kitchen? Do you chew sugarless gum? Do you pump your own gas? Do you use hairspray? Do you use artificial sweeteners? Smoke cigarettes? Drink diet soda? Use tampons? Do you ever have your clothes dry cleaned? Do you have silver fillings in your teeth?
Many company employees end up siding with the company because of Upton Sinclair's famous quote, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it." Judges and juries rarely know anything about statistics, and anyway, the companies do a great job with their PR firms rallying support in the community, so the parents frequently lose in court and the children keep getting cancer. Oof, I'm sorry to harsh your day. The parallel with nutrition is eerie. The same arguments the lawyers used in a civil action are all over social media. Correlation is not causation. There are many things it could be. People can't remember what they consumed. Observational studies rank lower than clinical trials, so we can't conclude anything. But we have a big advantage in diet that we didn't have in earth science, which is we can do short-term randomized feeding trials to humans and see what happens to things like blood tests. They can't prove causation of heart attacks and death because they're too short-term, but they can show biological plausibility, and combined with long-term trials, they can increase the level of certainty. And that's exactly how groups of scientists like Walter figured out that trans fats are not cool. Epidemiologists are not idiots. They have very deep statistical knowledge that almost no doctors, nutritionists, or social media influencers have. They often have to infer causality, as they had to do with smoking and trans fats, and we always had to do in earth science. To infer whether Yosemite was formed by glaciers, we didn't have the luxury of having control Yosemites that we could observe over millions of years. We couldn't do clinical trials of solvents on children to prove that they increase rates of leukemia where companies dump solvents in the water table. But the reverse is absolutely true. You don't get causation without correlation.
Epidemiology only shows associations. And nutritional epidemiology is particularly fraught because it depends on people reporting what they ate.
Questionnaire design is fascinating. You know how you sign up for a music service and they ask you a few questions about artists and songs you like, and then they're able to create playlists automatically for you with surprising accuracy? That's because certain bands and songs are tells. The services can't exhaust you by asking too many questions, so they must infer using very powerful statistics involving a lot of people. Epidemiologists have studied questionnaire design for half a century, and they can score questions according to how predictive they are in discerning your diet. Here's some examples. You don't need to know how the number in the right column is derived, other than they take years and thousands of test subjects. The key thing is the larger the number, the better it predicts the differences between people's diets. So beef doesn't say much, but hamburger does. Chicken no skin is a bigger tell than chicken with skin. Epidemiologists are very aware of healthy user bias among people who participate in studies, and answers to these questions are tells for that too. The actual questionnaires look something like this to get the frequency of a given food item that people consume. They also know there's a big difference between conceptual and specific questionnaires. For example, you can easily answer what your general dietary pattern was over the last year, but you can't remember what you ate last Tuesday, am I right? If they don't ask you to fill them out too often, they can ask as many as 130 questions, as Harvard does, and most people are still willing to fill them out carefully for decades. Statistical analysis of questionnaires with huge participant bases, as Harvard gets, shows them to be surprisingly reliable among responsible cohorts like nurses and health professionals. Everyone on the internet can quote a hierarchy of evidence that looks like this and sound very informed. But for chronic disease, because it takes a long time to develop, randomized trials don't work and prospective cohorts are far better. You may think meta-analyses are even better, but I cringe every time I see one.
Meta-analyses are out of control and need additional layers of review. The problem is that anybody with an internet connection can do a meta-analysis.
If the Cochrane Library does it, great, but I agree with Walter that they are out of control because people who don't actually do studies or fully understand them think they can do meta-analyses. And the worst of them get the most press because they defy what we know, making them newsworthy. All of that was a long lead-in to a recent Harvard study about oils in the nurses and health professional cohorts. 90,000 participants over 28 years with 37,000 deaths carefully followed. Walter's at Harvard and he's a co-author of this paper. Here's what they found. Nutrition is always about comparing one food to another, and in this study they compared olive oil to margarine, butter, mayonnaise, other vegetable oils, and dairy fat. And the study is big enough to do it for various diseases. This is for substituting 10 grams of olive oil per day for those other fats. That's only 3/4 of a tablespoon. You can see there's a greater than 10% reduction in mortality for just that small amount of olive oil. And how does it compare to other oils? The confidence intervals aren't as tight with this comparison, but in total mortality it looks like a wash between olive oil and other oils. That surprised me. For cardiovascular disease, olive oil might not be quite as effective as canola oil.
Canola oil actually shows further reduction in like your blood lipids, blood cholesterol, even when it's replacing, not just when it's replacing saturated fats, but when it's replacing olive oil.
But it might be more effective in preserving your brain. This study is so big and carefully done, there is no way the vegan community can match it. So, checkmate vegans? I mean, there is the Dean Ornish coronary study, the first study to show you could actually reverse heart disease in humans. But as Walter points out, that was a small study of just 48 people who were already quite ill with heart disease, and there were other interventions like meditation. So what about them vegans?
Instead of calling himself a vegan, Hugo decided that he was going to identify as, get ready for it because it is a humdinger, plant positive. Oh, nice work, Hugo. Successfully sidestepped the wanker bullet there, didn't we?
Dean Ornish is a giant in the field who has not only shown how diet and lifestyle can improve heart disease, but also prostate cancer, depression, diabetes, and the expression of our genes. He doesn't fully prohibit olive and canola oils, but he promotes a very plant-dominant diet with only 10% of calories coming from fat, which doesn't leave much room for oils. But I noticed one of his co-authors in their paper on telomere length versus lifestyle, the Nobel Prize winner Elizabeth Blackburn, went on to write a book recommending the Mediterranean diet. She recommends the little seaweed snacks that are roasted in olive oil. I don't like anecdotes, but here's one with real statistical power. The 3 men most responsible for the rise of the Mediterranean diet and the diet heart hypothesis are Ansel Keys, who lived to 100, Jerry Stamler, who recently passed at 102 and worked until the end, and Henry Blackburn, who ran the 7-country study for 50 years and looked so healthy at 97, I expect he'll live longer than Jerry did. The odds of an American man born in the early 1900s becoming a centenarian is about 1 in 10,000. Statisticians, what are the odds that all 3 men would achieve that? I asked Henry the other day, let me do some maths. Keys at 100, Stamler at 102, you at 110. What are the odds? Is it something the 3 of you were eating? He shot back, plus something our ancestors didn't eat? Fascinating. I definitely need to follow up on that. When great scientists disagree, what are you and I to do? We haven't devoted our lives to A-level research like they have, and yet for many meals we have to choose between them. Or do we? What if it's just a matter of context? The theme of this episode has been to hear from scientists who gave up a social media presence to actually do science full-time. So I'll start with Gary Fraser for the context question. He runs the Adventist 2 study, and both he and the study are deeply respected by scientists. He eats a little dairy and some fish, but he has 9,000 vegans in his study and knows them well.
Our cohort had about 96,000 people. About 25,000 of them were black. We began by, first of all, dividing them to different kinds of dietary patterns. We had about 42,000 who were non-vegetarians, nearly half, but about 9,000 who were vegan. I'd like to think a little bit about the vegan diet, and these diets are very different. And you can see that the green lines are really quite unusual as compared to the others. If we look at fruit and vegetables, the vegans look rather different. Plant protein foods, no surprise, a similar kind of thing. Animal protein foods, exactly the opposite. So vegan diets really are quite dramatically different to others.
I think what he's saying is some vegans want to take things to the next level, which describes me because apparently as a child on the streets, I came down with rheumatic fever, which did crazy damage to my heart. And that caused several of my doctors to be alarmed, plus I inherited the genetic high cholesterol that took my father and sister, so I can't mess around. The vegan doctors who are most vocal about no oils are usually dealing with advanced heart disease like Caldwell-Esselstyn, or diabetes like the 2 guys from the Mastering Diabetes program who I'll interview next week. Most of them say the studies are very conclusive about the health effects of substituting liquid oils for saturated fats, but it doesn't mean they're healthier than whole foods. Walter's context is to erect a big tent for the broader population, but I haven't heard him say that oils are superfoods, only that oils make superfoods like broccoli more palatable so you eat more of them. That gain. I think what Walter is saying is that nutrition policy should change from this,
just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down,
to this, just a spoonful of olive oil helps the veggies go down. Where is Julie Andrews when you need her? Walter and vegan scientists point out that some foods which are healthy for slender, active, healthy people no longer are when your health declines. Walter puts potatoes in that category, and many vegan scientists do the same with oils. For example, the vegan neurologists who have the best vegan recipes, the Scherzais, say, if you are a healthy person with a good body mass index, a little extra virgin olive oil dressing on your salad isn't going to hurt you. In fact, it will probably help you. But let's say we're talking about a man who's 50 years old, is overweight, and is pre-diabetic. In this case, we would want him to stay away from a lot of high-fat foods like oils. We feel that a diet can be healthy with or without the extra virgin olive oil depending on a person's baseline metabolic state. So I feel the 2 views are compatible. If Walter and Henry can get the masses to shift from saturated fats to liquid oils, huge win. Just look at the extraordinary success Pekka had in Finland. And when doctors like Ornish get patients with advanced disease, time to swap out the oils for healthier whole plant alternatives. Context. Stefan Guyenet is a good scientist with a good book who's concerned about seed oils for very good reasons. We consume them in ever-increasing quantity thanks to processed foods. Here's what he says on his blog. I feel the evidence behind the hypothesis that seed oils, corn, soybean, etc., promote obesity due to their linoleic acid, omega-6 fat, has largely collapsed. I think seed oils promote obesity because they're used to increase the reward/palatability value of processed food. But this would be equally applicable to animal fats and more saturated plant oils if they were used in the same foods. So what are those simple takeaways I promised at the beginning of the episode? I think they're: number 1, oils in processed foods are the devil. Number 2, liquid oils as a replacement for saturated fats and to help the veggies go down are awesome. And number 3, people who carry extra pounds, have heart disease or diabetes, would benefit from finding a whole food replacement to even the liquid oils, such as grinding up flax seeds to put on your salad. Wow, thank you for hanging in this whole long way, but I have a bone to pick with a few of you. I made a loose statement a few episodes back about Clint Eastwood leaning into high plant diets, and you've been calling me out in the comment sections ever since. Well, it turns out when I picked up this Dean Ornish book for this episode, I looked in the endorsements, and there was Clint Eastwood himself. I've been following Dean Ornish's program for more than a decade, and I feel younger now than I did 10 years ago. Dr. Ornish's style of eating and living is always delicious and never boring.